like to do is introduce the relationship between culture and civil society and the civic space, to put it in a little bit context, and I will, of course, build on what Annette Zimmer has been talking about. This gentleman here, who is our sort of patron, he gave us the name and lived 2,000 years ago, was a politician. At the same time, he was a great patron of the arts. He was a man involved in all kinds of other activities. So he symbolizes quite well this sort of close connection between various areas, various strata of society, and of course our own involvement in all this. But to get into the subject, I have perhaps a rather unusual photograph or picture of Shakespeare. Shakespeare, obviously one of the world's greatest poets and dramatists, was also a very political man. A good case in point is his play about Richard III, whom he depicted as an absolute villain and who murdered his nephews in the Tower and was a hunchback. None of this is true. He neither murdered his nephews, nor was he a hunchback, nor was he a villain. But it was Tudor propaganda, and so he was supporting the Tudor regime and trying to establish it against previous dynasties. So it shows that art is not something that is sort of beautiful and there somewhere, it's something extraordinarily political. And the same, of course, is true for civil society. Civil society organizations can be loyal, as in Shakespeare's case. He was loyal to the ruling Queen Elizabeth I. It can be exit, it can be sort of withdrawn, or it can be voiced. This applies to any organization, as Albert Hirschman established it a long time ago, but of course it works very well for any civil society organization as well, and I'll show you just a few examples. Voice, how come? How come? On the left you can see the Petit Trianon near Paris, which was slightly more modern than what had been built at Versailles, but it was still very much in the tradition. And on the right, you have revolutionary architecture, and you can see at a glance how different they are. A totally new approach to architecture. The building on the right was never built, but it was a whole new way of becoming political in the cultural world. Constructed within the time difference of about 10 years or designed. So. And this wonderful picture, which you might see as a sort of romantic idol, is in fact highly political, because the two gentlemen you see there are wearing clothes that were banned. They were not allowed to wear these kind of clothes. In German, this is Altdeutsche Tracht, and that was considered revolutionary, and people were not allowed to wear them. So what you see here is two people retreating from sort of the big scene in this particular garb. So it could be exit, but it could be voice too. The picture as such, which is of course a large size painting, is a political expression in an artistic formula. And that is very much related to what civil society does and what civil society stands for. In the previous presentation, in Kevin's presentation, there was a wonderful sentence, and it's very true indeed. Art is relatively safe and below the radar. That is absolutely true. And so if we're talking about civil society in an endangered environment, art, culture is very often the sort of safe haven of sorts. And it comes in with civil society as one of the three arenas in which collective action, political action, societal action takes place. There is, of course, a normative side to this in any case, and that is that the human being, M for man or woman, is at the center of the society. It's not society first, and then somewhere right down below there is the human being. No, it's the center. And woman and man break out into all kinds of activities with the state, with business, with civil society, as they so choose, as they need to, and they go backwards and forwards, they change between different, these different arenas. And that is this sort of movement within society is something that we value, something that we think very highly of, and something that is of course related quite a lot to what happens in the cultural sphere as well. The Germans among you will recognize this gentleman, Wolf Biermann, who was a singer, performer in the for much longer, but in the 1970s, in 1976, he was allowed to leave East Germany for a concert and then was not allowed back into East Germany. He had been banned from performing in East Germany for a few years before that. But then in 1976, he was finally banned from returning to East Germany. And this was a starting point for the whole civil rights, civil liberties, human rights movement in East Germany at the very beginning of the process that had been sort of sparked off a little bit by the final act of the European Conference, the Helsinki Conference, that sparked off other movements, some of them much stronger than in East Germany, in Poland and in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. But in East Germany too, this sort of started up, and again it was a cultural person who sort of gave it that push, in that case perhaps involuntarily because he was banned from returning, but he remained a sort of figurehead nevertheless. And it finally resulted in this kind of scene, which we should well remember. It's exactly 30 years ago now that civil society assembled on the Berlin Wall and finally made it come down. It was perhaps arguably civil society's finest hour anyway in Europe. And it started from these movements in all kinds of countries right across Central and Eastern Europe that had very much to do with the arts. And I'll show you one more person who of course is highly important in this context. You can all recognize Václav Havel. On the left, he's sitting there still as an intellectual, as a writer, having a probably fairly secret discussion with a writer from the West, Graham Greene in that case, and by 1989 he had become the leader of the movement in Czechoslovakia and then became the first head of state of Czechoslovakia and subsequently of the Czech Republic. So there is this interplay between civil society, between the whole cultural world, and of course with society in general. And finally, as another example, I suppose you all recognize him, Ai Weiwei from China, who's yes, been in the headlines for many years now, protesting, taking action, showing what is happening in his home country. He's doing this all around the world. Today, this voice has a slightly different dimension. This is quite obviously from Fridays for Future. That is perhaps not the cultural origin, but still it is probably the most forceful expression we have in civil society at the moment, and it is good to remember that what they stand for, what Fridays for Future stands for, has made climate change move up from right at the very bottom of the agenda to the very top. Civil society action started by first one and then a group of very, very young women mostly. I was in a conference at OECD of all places a few months ago in Paris, and there was a panel on climate change, and there was a young woman from Fridays for Future from Belgium. She had all the facts at her fingertips. She knew all the arguments. She was definitely, without sort of mentioning her age, the best and most able panelist, and she was 17 years old. So that is what we are living at the moment in terms of civil society action. But to show a comprehensive picture of civil society, you do have to remember that there is another side to it. It's not just people who are moving issues forward. It's also loyal to an existing society. It is community building. This is obviously a church choir performing or practicing. That too is, of course, civil society. We should not fall into the trap of sort of always thinking of them as protesters. And so we have, over the years, developed civil society with 8 different functions, and of course, many organizations perform in more than one, in several. And they reach from service provision, which is what big welfare organizations, non-governmental organizations do, and advocacy, which everybody knows about. It includes watchdog functions. Colin Crouch, an English sociologist, has said that that is probably the most important function of all, because Parliament is not performing, is not doing its watchdog stuff very well, and so civil society has to come in and be the watchdog. It is, of course, intermediary in many cases. It is self-help, but then there are a few new ones which some people don't like. It is shaping politics, contributing to political discussions. It's what Habermas has called deliberative democracy, a very, very important civil society function. It is, of course, community building, as new communities, communities of choice, increasingly take precedence over communities of faith. People belong to a community because they want to belong to it, and that is usually what happens in civil society, both sort of at local level, face to face, and of course via new media and new possibilities right across the globe. And finally, there is a highly important function, and that is personal growth, self-fulfillment. This is often totally forgotten. That one of the big chances that civil society brings to the table of society in general is that is where people can actually sort of live the life they want to live, and do what they want to do. And I think that is really very important. The government can't sort of make any arrangements for that, nor can business, but civil society can. So it's not coincidental that civic engagement is predominantly happening in civil society organizations. In Germany, it's around 80%, and similar figures, of course, exist in nearly any other country. One of the interesting sort of categories that you can make, and it's François Perroux who made it in half a century ago, is to give certain sort of attributes to these 3 arenas I mentioned. And civil society is the one where giving is highly important, as opposed to the state, that is quite rightly so, concerned with forcing people to do things, pay taxes, stop at the red light, obey laws, whatever. And business, of course, is usually an exchange mechanism. But if you don't have this element of giving, then society is in a very poor state. It's natural to human beings to give, but if you don't encourage it, if you don't make it possible, society is in a very poor state. And societies that have tried this, have tried to regulate on everything and organize everything on just force and exchange, have seen this happen. So what we would like to have, and this is very much something that is used in the UK, is this 3-legged stool. Society as a stool with 3 legs of even length, because that makes for a stable and yet thriving society. in the 1990s and 2000s, and Annette was referring to that, it sort of seemed as if we were going in that direction. But for the last 10 years or so, this sort of equilibrium, this stability, is being tampered with. And it's not being tampered with by civil society organizations. There are a few, but that is not the big problem. The big problem is that the state and sometimes the business community are introducing measures that tamper with equilibrium, and they affect everybody, and they are changing sort of the face of society. That is what we call this shrinking space, changing space, closing space phenomenon. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about this. Shrinking civic space, that's usually now sort of the standard name. If you want to call it the shrinking space for civil society, or the changing space for civil society, the closing space, changing space, it's always there for the same sort of phenomenon that is happening. It's pressure on the space, on civil society, on the arena of civil society, and it concerns both organized civil society, to say established organizations, large and small, and of course unorganized civil society, which is becoming more and more important. In all kinds of circumstances, you will have people assembling spontaneously, and they form spontaneous, unorganized civil society organizations. And they too, of course, are affected by these measures. Why is this so? If you ask government people why are they trying to clamp down on civil society, they will usually answer, yes, it's because of fighting terrorism, money laundering, and tax evasion. That is usually the standard argument. Or it will be security measures. But more often than not, that is an excuse. And I will come to another point in a minute. This excuse is being used worldwide. It's not just in certain countries. If you get government bureaucracies and they're told to develop controls, then there's sort of an automatic movement, and they get tighter and tighter and tighter. What we now have is an absolute control mania. We are controlled all the time. If you compare how often did you have to show or prove your identity 10 years ago, how often do you have to prove it today, it's a big, big difference. Government mistrusts its own citizens everywhere. And at the bottom of all this, it's of course fear that this new, comparatively new arena of civil society is becoming extremely powerful, as we see with Fridays for Future. So governments and others fear that they are losing power, and that is sort of the main point, that they want to clamp down on that. So what happens? And this has been mentioned before. We get legal obstruction. No donations from abroad. That's this famous foreign agents argument. Or no interference in politics. We're just having a very prominent court case about this in Germany. Or it's administrative obstruction, arbitrary registration requirements, or increased supervision. You suddenly have to file all kinds of documents and what have you. Perhaps even more important and even more biting are what one might call sort of soft measures, media campaigns, defamation, harassment, that it's very difficult to sort of really touch on, to classify, but it sort of happens. We've had instances in Parliament in Germany where members of Parliament in debate have used very strong wording against civil society organizations. They were building up an industry of organizations, things like that. And they came across as if the poor member of Parliament had sort of really worked himself up and it was sort of a spontaneous utterance. No, It was nothing like that. It had been carefully and strategically planned as a defamation campaign, and the Member of Parliament chose to use it at just that precise moment. We have, of course, attempts at influencing, infiltration, and we have attempts very strongly in Hungary, but in other countries too, at creating a sort of alternative, subservient civil society. Where does this happen? It happens, we all think of countries like China and Egypt and Hungary and Russia and Turkey, but we must be quite clear about this. It's happening in Western Europe and it's happening in North America just as much. It's perhaps not quite as strong, but it's happening everywhere in the world. So, luckily there is some good news to this, because counter movements are underway. Traditional big service providers are becoming advocates. A big organization like Caritas in Germany, 500,000 employees, is suddenly waking up and becoming advocate of the people they are looking after, something which was quite unheard of 20 years ago. Foundations and other NGOs are demanding to be heard in public affairs, to be part of a public debate, not as lobbyists, but as contributors to some issue. And citizens, as I said before, are giving communities of choice a much more important role. That is, has something to do with the crisis of the nation state and the crisis of democracy. But these new communities, and we heard about them before, are becoming more and more important, so that I would say, and I would argue, civic space is actually growing. It's not shrinking, it's growing worldwide. It looks like as if it was shrinking, but it isn't. There are some caveats, and they've been mentioned before. We like to think of civil society as the good ones, but they are not. There is a dark side to civil society. If we use this terminology, there are organizations around that are quite obviously part of civil society, but which we would definitely not approve of. So we must be careful. We can't just, sort of have this sort of bandwagon of civil society doing good things. On the other hand, of course, it's not good enough for civil society just to argue, well, we are the good ones. We are doing good things for society. This needs to be underpinned with certain values and certain actions, like commitment to an open society, commitment to pluralism, respect for others, sincerity, accountability, commitment to public purposes, transparency. These are some of many more things which we would need to judge whether an organization is actually a good civil society. I'm nearly finished. People are getting nervous, but I'm nearly finished. So, civil society does not depend, as some people argue, on a democratic environment to exist. As we have seen, it exists in regimes that are not democratic. It's of particular importance, of course, in a regime that is not democratic. It can be enhanced, it can be visualized, and it can be protected by art and by culture. And this formula of being relatively safe and below the radar is exactly what I mean by that. It can prepare the ground and herald the arrival of transition, and it can teach the state and business qualities like loyalty, civility, and civic engagement. That is what civil society is for. And so cultural cooperation under these auspices is something about that governmental foreign policy should introduce civil society as a standing feature. It should be much more responsive to civil society organizations than it has been in the past. It should remember cultural policy, it should remember the political thrust of culture, and it should make use of cultural intermediaries, because they are an ideal base for introducing civil society to cultural cooperation and cultural policy. Government action should make use of the advanced cooperative structures that exist in civil society. A lot of things that matter terribly to government people don't matter, like nationality, for instance, don't matter to civil society people. So that is the message really that we might try and convey. There was one more, but it's not coming. The machine is stopping. There was one more slide, but it's not. Here we are. That's it, but now we just have to introduce it. That is my final slide. This is an astonishing thing of culture going ahead. You all probably know, yeah, that's one. You all probably know what the encyclopédie is. It was the famous document, 27 volumes, of an encyclopedia prepared by a group of French philosophers in the 18th century. And that is the frontispiece. What you see is the frontispiece on the right, sort of repeated, slightly clouded in a ceiling of a Catholic monastery in Bavaria, Poli. So you see how the fairly revolutionary idea, as expressed in the encyclopédie, makes its way via culture into general political thought. And so if we can get that going, I think we're very well off. Thank you very much.